I appreciate your time coming down on a Sunday. And it's always a real pleasure to step outside of the university and talk about exciting history stuff to the general public. So again, thank you. I promise you that there's going to be a whole lot of images in this talk. And I'm not going to do death by PowerPoint. I understand the problems with death by PowerPoint. However, let me start with a death by PowerPoint slide. I want to give you a few guiding questions to think about as I'm talking for the next 45 minutes or so. The primary guiding question for this talk today, and also for this series that the Central Library is hosting, is how do we view World War I? And there are so many different perspectives from which we look at World War I, and that's going to determine how we view this war, what kind of a war it is in our minds. So I'll keep coming back to that. How do we view World War I question? That's our central guiding question. Second central guiding question is, what is a legitimate state? What is a legitimate government? And this will be a theme throughout the talk, so keep this in mind. What is legitimate government? Is an empire a legitimate government? A large political system where a central power governs over people in a far-flung geographic area that maybe they do or maybe they don't have a ethnic, linguistic, cultural, genetic, any sort of connection to them. Is an empire legitimate or not? Is a nation legitimate or not? Or maybe more legitimate? The idea that the political body is a community where everyone imagines themselves as being part of the same community, sharing a same mythology, a same culture, a same language. The nation is the product of 19th century European political and cultural developments, and it becomes globalized in the 20th century. We now have a United Nations, right? We don't have a United Empires that meets in New York. That would be a no-no. We've got a United Nations. So the nation state becomes a dominant paradigm. And importantly, it's World War I that really is that hinge point in global history between a world of empires and a world of nation states. And the Sykes-Picot Treaty plays a very important role in that. Also, what is the role of pluralism? The nation implies a certain degree of homogeneity, that everyone imagines themselves to be French, or to be German, or to be Japanese, or to be Nigerian. But what if in Nigeria, as there is, there are many different cultural identities, or linguistic identities, or ethnic identities, or religious identities? How does a nation state cope with pluralism? Pluralism is really problematic for a nation state. It's easier for an empire, but it's problematic for the nation state. And then geography. Does geography play a role in determining political legitimacy? Is it legitimate for a state to expand into the neighboring area and having the real estate next to you part of your state? Is that more legitimate than getting into a boat, traveling to the other side of the world, and claiming territory as part of that state? Do states have to be geographically linked, united, or can there be a spread, separation, among territories as part of the state. And then, third guiding question, where does legitimacy come from? Throughout much of human history, political legitimacy comes from above, right? European history talks about the divine right of king. In Islamic history, the idea of the caliphate, one united political entity of the believers. What about ethno-sectarianism? Being part of an ethnic or religious group. That is a form of legitimacy much more closely tied to the idea of the nation state. And then finally, the idea of the imagined community. That political legitimacy comes from a conscious act of imagining, inventing the nation state, but also, importantly, of forgetting. And this is an idea laid out in Ernest Renan's 1882, What is a Nation? He's a French scholar, French linguist, who developed the idea of the nation state in its full sort of intellectual development. And one of his central ideas is that the essence of a nation is that all the individuals have many things in common, but also have to forget a lot of things. So he holds up France. France is a nation state. There are many things in common that unite France. Good wine, cheese, a proper baguette, right? But what do they have to forget? Things like the St. Bartholomew's Massacre, where Catholics murdered Protestants in the streets. They have to forget all sorts of problematic issues in the history of France that would divide the nation. So the idea of the nation, or the state, as an act of imagining, but also forgetting. It's a really important theme for the legacy of Sykes-Picot. Now, that was a little bit of death by PowerPoint, so I'm going to liven things up and show you a ISIS propaganda video that came out about 2 years ago. And you've probably seen clips of this on the news. And ISIS, the Islamic State, Daesh, however you want to call them, is particularly noteworthy for their very shrewd and sophisticated use of social media and high tech to present their message. So here's a video. We'll watch about 4 minutes of this.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. As you can see right now in the border of Iraq and Sham.
He's from Chile, by the way.
دولة الإسلام قامت بدماء الصادقين أمتي قد لاح فجر فارقب النصر المبين دولة الإسلام قامت بدماء الصادقين.
Right now on the side of Sham, as you can see, this is the so-called border of Sykes-Picot. Alhamdulillah, we don't recognize it and we will never recognize it. Inshallah, this is not the first border we will break. Inshallah, we break other borders also, but we start with this, inshallah. So inshallah, we walk, inshallah, we cross the border. And we see that, alhamdulillah, it used to be the Safawi army used to stand here. We used to stand here. This is the so-called border with the police and the police pass. Alhamdulillah, there's nobody now except the soldiers of Islam. So alhamdulillah, inshallah, we cross the border. Bismillah. This is the so-called checkpoint. The soldiers of Pakistan. And as you can see here is a sign. It says Commandos Battalion Border. The only commandos in battalion here is the Battalion of Islam, inshallah. And as you can see, this is under our feet right now. That's Abu Bakr Baghdadi used to say, he's the breaker of barriers. Inshallah, we'll break the barrier of Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, all the countries, inshallah. Until we reach Quds, inshallah. It's the first barriers of many barriers we'll break, inshallah. We come, inshallah.
لن يعود النصر إلا بدماء الشهداء.
This is like a map of the border. This is Iraq, this is Sham. But now It's all one country, inshallah, one dawla, inshallah, one ummah, inshallah. There is no more border. خلاص.
الإسلام قامت بدماء الصادقين أمتي قد لاح فجر فارقب النصر المبين دولة الإسلام
This is
قامت.
the flag of Iraq, flag of ship. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, whoever calls to nationality is not from me. So we make bara for this flag, inshallah. This is a building where the soldiers of the Safawi, the Murtadin, used to be. This is the checkpoint close to the border. This is the place where they used to be. See, full of kufr and shit.
ليقام الدين فيها شر رب العالمين أمتي تستبشر.
And I think you get the point. It goes on for videos about 15 minutes, and the ISIS representative, the Islamic State representative, who, by the way, is identified as Chilean. Interesting. He throws into question. He throws into question this idea of what is the legitimacy of the state. He's tossing away the nation. And he's saying that the real legitimacy for the state that they are creating comes from divine power. And for our purposes, the title of the video is The End of Sykes-Picot. And what they're erasing are boundaries which they consider to have been imposed upon the Arab world by French and British colonial powers in the early 20th century. In one of the few moments that the leader of the Islamic State has appeared in public in Mosul in July 2014, he gave a speech where he said that breaking the border between Syria and Iraq, this is not the first border we will break. The blessed advance will not stop until the last nail in the coffin of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. So clearly, the Sykes-Picot Treaty is something really important in the thinking of one of the key conflicts in the world today, right? So what is the Sykes-Picot Treaty? Or really the Sykes-Picot Agreement, because it was never a formal treaty, and truth be told, it was never actually put into effect. It was really sort of a wish list. During the First World War in May of 1916, the 100th anniversary was actually about 2-3 weeks ago of the creation of this agreement. Two officials, one from France, one from Britain, mid-level officials, not top diplomats, but mid-level officials, got together and sat down with a big map and began to draw lines on a map, dividing up the Arab lands held by the Ottoman Empire. And the French said they wanted this area to the north. This blue area would be under their direct control. This area marked A would be their sphere of influence or zone of influence. The British wanted the area coming up from the Persian Gulf, Basra, up here to about, I believe, to about Tikrit. That would be under their direct control. And then this B area would be a zone of influence. This area right here would be an international area, probably ministered by the British, but an international area. This is mostly what is today the state of Israel and Palestine. This was their wish list, and if you read many of the editorials that have appeared in the past couple weeks on this centennial of Sykes-Picot, they'll frequently tell you these are the lines on the map that determine the boundaries of the nation states of the Middle East. Well, kind of not. Some of these boundaries actually don't correspond to the political makeup of the 20th century states in the Middle East. Some of them do. What's important is this was the wish list. This was the aspirations of the French and the British during World War I. That as they're fighting the war in northwestern Europe, they're also thinking about building empire after the war, and building empire at the expense of the defeated Ottoman Empire. And they're doing so in a rather cavalier way. Here is Picot, who was a rather later on he'll become more high-ranking French diplomat, sort of mid-career at this point in 1916. And this is Sykes, who's a much lower level official, but actually had much better knowledge of the Arab world and had traveled a fair amount in the Arab world and written several books. Not everyone agrees that he was maybe the best scholar of the Arab world. T.E. Lawrence, famous Lawrence of Arabia, for example, did not think very highly of him. Thought that he was sort of a B or C grade thinker about the Middle East. But he's got some knowledge on the ground, and much more so than his colleague Picot. But famously, they divided up the Arab lands of the Ottoman Empire in a rather cavalier manner. This quote is from Sykes, where after the fact he said, "I should have liked to have drawn the line from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk, but they're just sort of playing with the map." And that's sort of the central mythology of the Sykes-Picot Treaty, is that the Western powers barged in, drew lines on the map, decided the fate of people on the other side of the world without asking them. Without asking people like King Faisal, who is briefly the king of Syria in 1920, I'll come back to this, and then later the king of Iraq from 1921 to his death in 1933, one of the main political actors at this time. This is who Lawrence of Arabia is working with. As part of my preparation for this last night, I screened the private screening on my laptop of Lawrence of Arabia, which is one of my guilty pleasure films. It gets a lot of things wrong. It's very much a colonial fantasy, but it is such a beautiful film. Just absolutely amazing. And if you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, you know the relationship that develops between Lawrence and Faisal, who was then a prince. But Sykes-Picot ignores the desires of Arab elites. It also ignores the desires of the average Arab on the ground, many of whom did the fighting to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. They're getting cut out of this process of determining the political makeup of the Arab world after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So let's come back to one of our central questions here, our guiding questions. How do we view World War I? Well, when most of us think about World War I, we think of it as the Western European War, right? It's the trenches that make World War I so famous and so horrifying, and rightly so. And the European vision of World War I is the war as 4 years of human tragedy, 4 years of industrialized mass murder, a huge mistake that should have been avoided, a tragedy that we slid into, things got out of control, and one of the great symbols for the 20th century pacifist movement, to avoid war in the industrial age because it's so horrifying. The so-called battles of the Western Front show us the horrors of industrialized mass murder. Human beings being dehumanized by the slog of trench warfare. The horrifying weapons introduced, such as poison gas at Ypres, which as a historian of imperialism, I will point out that poison gas was first used by the Germans against French forces from Africa. First used by Germans against black African troops. Then later on used against white troops. But the colonial troops were the first sort of victims of one of the great horrors of the First World War. The horrors of the Battle of the Somme, which, pardon my, well, it's not French, pardon my French, but in the British Army was known as the Great Fuck-Up. Because on the first day, some 60,000 young men lost their lives. I live in Santa Cruz, California. That's the population of Santa Cruz, wiped out on the first day of this battle. And the battle goes on for months. And the gains are measured in hundreds of meters. Just absolutely horrifying, right? The Battle of Verdun is so famous for the French example. Here's where General Neville famously said they shall not pass. This is frequently wrongly attributed to General Pétain. And J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, plagiarized it and has Gandalf say this in The Lord of the Rings. He tells the Balrog? Thank you. So in the You Shall Not Pass, J.R.R. Tolkien is a survivor of trench warfare on the Western Front, and arguably his visions of Mordor and of absolute evil were inspired by the horrors of trench warfare. The Battle of Champagne, where the French army finally cracked in April 1917. And again, this absolute horror that Western European men are thrown into, and it is primarily men in this war. And the Western European view is of this human tragedy that we slid into. And that sense of human tragedy really dominates the European view and the European historiography of the war, and pushes aside some of the other stuff, like Sykes-Picot, some of the imperialist machinations, the behind-the-scenes agenda that's going on, the war of expansion. That gets sort of pushed aside because the war was this great collective tragedy that needs to be memorialized so that we can avoid such horrifying incidents again. So for much of the 20th century, Sykes-Picot sort of forgotten about from the European perspective. And the American perspective on the war is also guilty of a certain amnesia regarding things like Sykes-Picot. Thanks to Woodrow Wilson, the American perspective on the war is very optimistic and idealistic. Woodrow Wilson gives his famous 14-point speech in January of 1918, which actually is in response to Sykes-Picot. I'll get to that in a little bit. Where he puts out 14 points, 14 pathways to peace, which emphasize national self-determination and democracy for the people of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for the people of the Ottoman Empire, and for the people of the colonial world. And he explicitly states that this war will not be a war of annexations. It will be a war for democracy. And the United States attitude towards the war is very optimistic, is really as a mission, as a crusade for democracy. Here's a cartoon, it's a little grainy, but here's the Kaiser, the evil Hun, looking at these steps towards peace. And that's the only way to peace up there. He's got to follow Wilson's way. And in many ways, the reality of World War I, at least in Europe, of the absolute horrors, is not really part of the American experience. It was a crusade to create a real world, a crusade to create a better world that in many ways failed and led to American disillusionment with Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, and led to the isolationist sense, the isolationist movement of 1920s and 1930s in the United States, not wanting to get involved in European affairs. So the Sykes-Picot Treaty doesn't really have a place in the American worldview. This is for the United States, the war is sort of viewed as a lost opportunity when this idealistic Woodrow Wilson could have remade the world, but failed to do so. But again, back to our central question, our guiding question. How do we view World War I? Well, another way to view it is as an imperialist war of expansion. And in this narrative, it's frequently the Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Hun, the man who told his troops when they were going off to suppress the Boxer Rebellion to behave with the barbarism of the Hun and get revenge for Germany. Who talked about a cultural struggle, who famously behaved like a bull in a china shop, who demanded Germany's place in the sun. Why does he take such an aggressive position? Many psychohistorians have ventured into the Kaiser's personal psychology. He is born into a warrior elite of the Prussian nobility, becomes the Emperor of Germany, yet had a number of physical limitations and was perhaps, shall we say, overcompensating for some of these limitations. There's a lot of speculation on that the Kaiser had a certain crisis of masculinity himself and was, again, overcompensating with a military presence and bearing. The kind of history is is fun and entertaining, but very difficult history to do, because it leads to a lot of psychoanalytic speculation. Nonetheless, it is clear that the Kaiser is the big disruptor in the years at the end of the 19th century and the first 14 years of the 20th century. The Kaiser is the head of the German Empire, which is a new state. Prior to 1870, there is no Germany. There is no Germany in the world. It's a newly created state. The German Empire is built by the Prussian conquest of other German-speaking lands and territories. And most of the Germans, not the Austrians, but most of the Germans are brought into a German empire via wars of imperialist expansion. The last of which was the Franco-Prussian War, where the mean old Bismarck picked a war with poor little France and used it to unify the southern part of Germany and also steal Alsace-Lorraine. But that is the kind of state system that the Kaiser inherits. An empire built upon wars of imperialist expansion. And at the turn of the century, the Kaiser wants to get into the colonial game. There's a famous cartoon of the European powers carving up China. Poor China standing behind, watching China be. The famous line is China was divided up like a melon. This, for some reason, is a pizza. It's, the Italians are on the cartoon here, but I guess they're divided up like a pizza. And the Kaiser demanded colonial possessions. He wanted to be like France and Germany, and even Belgium. Little tiny Belgium has this massive colonial empire here in Africa. Little tiny Netherlands has a massive colonial empire in Southeast Asia. And the Kaiser demanded his place in the sun, Germany's place in the sun. They needed colonies. But Germany was late to the colonial game and got a few colonies, but they're really not the prime colonial possessions. They did not get an India or a Southeast Asia or a Spice Islands. They got some areas in Southern Africa, lovely areas, I'm sure, but much of this is desert. A few islands in the Pacific. I mean, I really wonder about what happened in the minds of the Prussian officer who was stationed in some of these islands in the southwestern Pacific, or in New Guinea, and what they thought they were going to do in terms of building an empire. But the German mindset is very much expansionist and desiring to build an empire. And if this can't happen overseas in the colonial world, then maybe, say many extreme German nationalists, then maybe we can build an empire closer to home through Central Europe into the areas down towards the Ottoman Empire. Maybe this can be Germany's empire, a Mittel Europa. And they emphasize things like the Berlin to Baghdad Railway. And this is going to be Germany's colonial possessions in this part of the world. Later on, of course, Adolf Hitler will come back to this idea. Much of the Second World War could be understood as Hitler attempting to create a colonial empire, not in the tropics, but in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, we were warned about this. Prior to the First World War, European socialists, some of the most prominent of which, Rosa Luxemburg, but also Lenin, warned us that the European powers were governed by expansionists, governed by imperialists, who were going to engage in a war to build empires. So this was in the nature of the political state system circa 1905, 1910. Lenin famously published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. We were warned. And the socialists had regular meetings. This is a meeting of the Second International. You see Rosa Luxemburg there in the front row, the only woman present at the meeting of the Socialist International. And at the Socialist International meetings, the parties of Europe, the socialist parties of Europe, pledged that if war should break out, the members of the Socialist Party and the leadership of the Socialist Party would not support the war. The workers would go out on strike. Socialist members of parliament would stand in opposition to the war, would vote against war credits. They would not let war happen. Why? Because according to Luxembourg, according to the members of the Socialist International, such a war would be a war of imperialist expansion, would not be in the interest of the working class, be in the interest of the bourgeoisie, the bankers, the industrialists, and they would stop. They would stop the war. So we were warned. So Sykes-Picot should come as no surprise. This is the way that the European powers thought going into the war. And they view empires as a legitimate form of government. An empire is a legitimate form of government to the British monarchy. That should be kind of obvious. But also to the French Third Republic. The Third Republic, in existence from 1871 until it finally commits suicide with the Nazi invasion in 1940, is the most progressive left-wing government in Europe. And it possesses the second largest colonial empire at the time. So across the political spectrum in Europe, from monarchy to republic, they're on board with colonizing the rest of the world. And we were warned. So Sykes-Picot should really come as no surprise. And we've seen things like Sykes-Picot before. Why does the map of Southeast Asia look like this? Why do the people of Sumatra belong to the nation state of Indonesia? And they're about a mile away from the Malay Peninsula. And these people belong to Malaysia. Two different nation states. When in reality, this is the same ethno-linguistic group. They speak the same variant of Malay. They're interrelated. They're related via trade. Religiously very close. Whereas Javanese are very dissimilar in many ways. And the further east we go, the less Malay these people are. Why would the people of Western New Guinea be in the same nation state as the people of this part of Sumatra? Well, when the British and French were colonizing Southeast Asia, at one point in 1824, they drew a line on a map. They drew a line between Sumatra and said, okay, Dutch, you get the islands. Go for it. Do what you can do in terms of empire building. We British, we'll take the Malay Peninsula, and we're going to build what we can build here. This divides the Malay people. Separates these two groups that would normally be together, were we to follow Ernst Renan's sort of principles of the nation. But also throws these people into the same state system as all these other people. 350 different languages in Indonesia today. Not dialects, languages. 350 different languages. It's not really a nation in the normal definition of a nation. But anyway, I digress. The Europeans have been drawing lines on a map, dividing people that would be together, and also throwing people that were dissimilar into the same administrative unit. And fast forward 130 years, when Indonesia gets independence, they adopt the colonial boundaries. So that today, this is Indonesia, and that's Malaysia, two different nation states, which if allowed to develop organically, probably would have been a nation state uniting this area. It would be different from a nation state down here, a Javanese nation state. But this is the kind of thing Europeans have been doing. Africa is the great example. Africa in 1880 with very limited European presence. Then Africa on the eve of the First World War, with all of Africa, with one big exception of Ethiopia, under one European form of domination or another. Frequently with lines decided not by events on the ground in Africa, lines decided not by geography or ethnic identity or linguistic patterns or economic relationships, but lines decided literally in a smoke-filled room in Europe. Places like Berlin, the Congress of Berlin. with Bismarck and King Leopold II from Belgium, who's probably the most nefarious of these cast of characters. King Leopold's probably the absolute worst. With a big map of Africa on the wall. A bunch of white guys sitting around a table deciding the fate of a continent that most of them have never been to and will never go to. And they really don't know what's in the interior, but they're drawing lines on the map. And this establishes the colonial framework for the continent, which newly independent states inherit as their new political boundaries. So Sykes-Picot, really, no surprise. This is how European states act. It's the Sykes-Picot. Those two guys sitting around with a map, dividing up the Middle East. That logic makes absolute sense. And this kind of thing happens in Europe as well. The Austro-Hungarian Empire. I was asking my students, what's the problem with the Austro-Hungarian Empire? I tell them that the problem is in the name. Austro-Hungarian Empire? Austro-Hungarian, what is that? And it's not just Austria and Hungary, an ethnically German Austria and Hungary. It's a whole lot of other people. It is a multi-ethnic empire where it doesn't matter what language subjects speak and the monarch speaks. What matters is the imperial title for the emperor and having feudal control over this massive amount of territory. And that's all fine and good. This is actually the way most political organizations in the grand scheme of human history have been organized. This is the for 3,000 years, 4,000 years of human history. This is sort of the norm for the state system, empires. All right? But what's the problem? In the decades prior to the First World War, we have the rise of nationalism. And the Slavic people, and the Croatian people, maybe would like to establish their own national state. They want to use an ethnic, a linguistic, a cultural identity to determine their political boundaries. And this kind of drawing lines on the map in Europe is sort of going the way of the dinosaurs. And the multi-ethnic empires of Austro-Hungary, of the Russian Empire, of the Ottoman Empire, of the German Empire, they'll all be destroyed by World War I. And Europe will be brought into an era where nation states determine the political framework. Okay? One of the things I said at the beginning of the lecture is that World War I is this important hinge point between the age of empire and the age of the nation state. As a side note, I think we may be on another hinge point between the age of the nation state and the age of something else. Well, unclear. Maybe Bill Gates and the multinational corporation, or Nike, or Apple is going to be the primary unit of human organization in the future. Don't know. I think we're maybe seeing the twilight of the nation state right now. But back to my point here, multi-ethnic empires are the way the European powers are thinking. But it's at this moment of paradigm shift, from empire to nation state. Yet the old way of thinking is continuing. So even as smart people in the Austro-Hungarian Empire realize the situation is desperate but not serious, that the days are numbered, the thing's going to come crashing down before too long, even as that is going on, other European powers are making decisions based upon that same logic. In 1915, there was another secret treaty, the Treaty of London. This brought Italy into World War I. Italy initially was supposed to go into World War I on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And the smartest thing any Italian government ever did was not go to war in August 1914, to not honor their treaty obligations, to go to war against France and Britain and Russia. The dumbest thing the Italian government has ever done was to go to war in 1915 on the opposite side. They went to war against Germany and against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What pretty good against the Austro-Hungarian forces, but then the German forces just absolutely devastated them. Read your Hemingway, right? Farewell to Arms, and all that. Absolute disaster for the Italian army. But why did Italy switch sides? Why was it brought in on the other side? Promises of land. This coastline along here. What's going to become the coastline of Yugoslavia after the war, including the Dalmatian Islands, which is, of course, the home of the infamous 101. The jokes, few far between. World War is kind of a sad thing. I've got a few. But I bring up the Treaty of London here to show the way that the European powers are wheeling and dealing behind the scenes. Hey, Italy, join us in the war effort. We'll give you some land. Secret treaty, don't tell anybody about it. Same thing with Sykes-Picot. Secret agreement, don't tell anybody else. Sykes-Picot is a secret agreement between France, Britain, but also Russia. Russia's not a formal, they formally don't sign them out, but there's a Russian representative at the meeting. And this is frequently forgotten. But there's a representative of the Russian Tsarist government at the meeting with Sykes-Picot. And the Russian Tsarist government allowed this to happen. They also got a copy of the secret treaty and took that back to the Russian capital and put it in the archives of their foreign ministry. What are the goals of the British and the French here? Well, the British are always concerned about India. Pretty much any question in this time period, you ask about the British Empire, will come back to India somehow. And they're always concerned about protecting their travel lines to India. And at this point, to get to India from Britain, you go through the Mediterranean, you go through the Suez Canal, so that means they got to control Egypt. So that means they'd like to also control the other side of the Suez Canal, go around the Arabian Peninsula, pass by the Persian Gulf, so they'd like to control some territory in the Persian Gulf, and that will guarantee their supply lines to India. The other big concern of the British Empire in this time period is the Great Game. Read your Kipling. Kim, the novel Kim, is all about the Great Game, the struggle for mastery of Asia between the British Empire and the Russian Empire. This is frequently talked about in terms of Central Asia, but also in terms of China, but also in terms of the Middle East, because Russia's just right there. And the British want to have a bulwark against Russian expansion southward. The French have all sorts of economic interests. They have investments in this part of the Ottoman Empire. They also have cultural and religious linkages to various Christian communities in this territory here. So they're dividing up territory based upon a variety of concerns, and they're not taking into account the concerns of the political leaders on the ground here, the Arab leaders, or obviously the Arab people on the ground. So again, how do we view World War I? Well, we primarily view it as the struggle along the Western Front here, a front that barely moves in the space of 4 years. Probably about 10 million men lost their lives in this front that didn't move very much over the course of 4 years. But we forget about all this stuff down here. There's tremendous military campaigns as the British go up against what Churchill called the soft underbelly of the Central Powers. The failed mission in Gallipoli, the somewhat more successful invasion of southern Mesopotamia, with a few setbacks there. And then, towards the end of the war, the dramatic push into the Ottoman Empire, up the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, but also up the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And 1917, 1918, you have this dramatic defeat of Turkey. And in terms of a world historical perspective, this is a big deal. The final defeat of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is one of the world's great empires in history. This is the Ottoman Empire at its height, and it is spectacular and spectacularly wealthy. Incredible military and economic power. Flourishing cultural center. But after 1680 or so, 1700, starts to go into a period of decline. And as we get into the 19th century, the decline gets pretty dramatic. France gobbles up Algeria. Territory is lost to the expanding Austro-Hungarian Empire. Italians get involved. The British get involved. So that as we get into World War I, the once gigantic Ottoman Empire is big. It's not gigantic, but it's big. And it has this history of losing pieces. It was known as the sick man of Europe, because pieces of the empire were falling off like a patient of a Hansen's disease patient or a leprosy patient. The idea was that the empire is collapsing in front of our very eyes. So the military plan was to weaken the Ottoman Empire by creating chaos in these southern reaches. And this is where Lawrence of Arabia famously steps in. Again, it's okay to enjoy the movie. It's a beautiful movie. It's an imperialist fantasy. There are some things that are wrong, but it's so beautiful. David Lean was just such an absolute master. But Lawrence's story is uniting the fighting Arab tribes into an organized political movement to challenge the Turks. What does that sound like? People on the ground taking serious that idea of national self-determination, building a nation, imagining a community. This is not Sykes-Picot's map. This is Lawrence's map. He had a vision of what the post-Ottoman Middle East would look like. With a couple of different states. He recognizes Iraq as a state, but letting these people determine their political boundaries. Why are the British here, though? They're here to weaken the Ottoman Empire. Weakening the Ottoman Empire by making promises to ethnic minorities, the Arab minority, in the Ottoman Empire, and causing disturbances, causing a weakening of the Ottoman military might from behind. At the same time, the British are also making promises to the Zionist movement, particularly to European Jews, to win their support for the war. And in 1917, in November 1917, Balfour makes a public declaration that Britain will support the establishment of a Jewish state in territory of the former, soon-to-be former, Ottoman Empire. This is important because this is the same territory that Lawrence is promising to Faisal, that the British are promising to the Arabs. So they're making promises right and left to all sorts of people to create allies to weaken the Ottomans, and these promises are contradictory. And when Faisal and other Arab leaders find out about this, they're furious. They feel betrayed by the British. British via Lawrence had done so much to support them in their claims to establish an Arab nation state out of the soon-to-be ashes of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, they're promising territory to others. In steps the United States, Woodrow Wilson. We don't have time to go through all of this, but we seek no conquest, no domination. We're going to make this a world safe for democracy. This American attitude on the entry to the war is spoiled by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The United States gets into World War I in April 1917. It's easier for the United States to get into the war because the Tsar, the Russian Tsar, has been overthrown in February and March of 1917. And now, the war is an alliance of the French Third Republic, the British constitutional monarchy, it has universal man and suffrage, it's a monarchy, but it's a democracy, and the new Russian Republic. That allows the United States, in its small r Republican values, to enter the war as an alliance of 4 democratic states against the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. It becomes a war of democracy against empire. Doing good democracy things with Republican values, small r Republican values, right? But then Lenin And the Bolsheviks seize power in the fall of 1917. And what's one of the first things they do? They go into the foreign ministry. And you know what they find? Secret treaties. They find the Treaty of London that promised land to Italy. They find the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And what do? They publish them in Izvestia and Pravda. And then the Manchester Guardian picks up the story and publishes the text in English. Huge embarrassment. What does this do to Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points? It's a huge embarrassment. Actually, excuse me, 14 points. Made a mistake there. What does this do to Woodrow Wilson and the American optimistic view of the war? It's a huge embarrassment. And Woodrow Wilson has to issue the 14 points in January of the following year to respond to this. Say, okay, we're going to get rid of secret treaties. It's one of the main points, one of the first points. Get rid of secret treaties, national self-determination. So 1917, this becomes a new kind of war. Or does it really? The Americans would like to make it a new kind of war, but again, it's not really their war. It's not really their war. The European powers are still continuing with that mindset of imperialist expansion. And of course, Luxembourg and Lenin at this point get to give you a big loud, we told you so. But the socialist argument that many people dismissed, that this was going to be a war of imperialist annexations and aggression, was kind of right. So how do we view World War I as it comes to an end? The war to end all wars is the phrase used by H.G. Wells, used by Woodrow Wilson once, but becomes most associated with Woodrow Wilson. And at the Paris Peace Conference, that gives us the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Sèvres, the various treaties that dismantle the losing powers. You have this conflict between Wilsonian idealism and European imperialism. The new optimistic, idealistic attitude of the 14 points versus the way Europeans had been doing stuff for well over 100 years. Now, the European idealism is played out, the Wilsonian idealism is played out in the ashes of the former German Empire, Russian Empire, and Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have the creation of nation states along ethno-linguistic lines. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia. Well, there's a problem there because they're both Czechs and Slovaks, and that's no longer with us, right? But at the time, it seemed pretty good. Austria, sever off that German section. But wait, don't let those Germans join with those Germans because they'd be too big. So, okay, no national self-determination for all Germans. We'll have 2 German states. Hungary, okay, that kind of works. Yugoslavia, put all the Slavs together, the Southern Slavs. Well, actually, there's a big diversity amongst the Southern Slavs. And Yugoslavia doesn't make it out of the 20th century. But again, like Czechoslovakia, it's an attempt to create nation states here. And this becomes the model. And it's one of the things we associate with the Peace of Paris, this implementation of national self-determination in Europe. What about national self-determination for the rest of the world? What about those promises made to people like Faisal? And here's Faisal at the Peace of Paris conference with Lawrence just behind him. Not as handsome as Peter O'Toole, a charismatic figure by all accounts. Well, who else is at the Peace of Paris? I mean, Faisal represents the Arab world and has a number of promises made to him. Greeks are also there. And the Greek situation is very complicated. Greece had, in the past century, achieved its independence from the Ottoman Empire, but there are many Greeks still living in areas under Turkish control. And Greek nationalists start dreaming of a greater Greece. It will control all this area. A big chunk of Asia Minor will be part of their greater Greek world. And initially, they claim these territories and are given control of these territories at the Peace of Paris. Also, Armenia. The Armenian delegation, this is a difficult map to see, but the Armenian delegation at the Peace of Paris claims all of this territory based on historical argument going back to about 80 BCE. the largest extent of the Kingdom of Armenia. That's what they want back. It was 2,000 years ago, but that's what they want back. So all sorts of different groups that could become nation states out of the ruins of the Ottoman Empire are making their claims. Greeks and Armenians, and there's considering what has happened to the Armenian people leading up to this point, the Armenian genocide under the Young Turk regime. There's a certain degree of sympathy for these claims. But the treaty that's worked out tears up the Ottoman Empire and leaves really this area right here under Turkish control. This is given to Greece. This is an Italian zone of occupation. The French grab this area, that to the Armenians, and the British grab this area. So the Treaty of Sèvres that comes out of the Peace of Paris, the treaty that's given to the collapsed Ottoman Empire, gives us a Turkey that's even smaller than the Turkey today. And the Turks say absolutely no way. They'd actually been fighting for a few months before this, but they launched a formal war, what's known as the Turkish War for Independence, and fight against these various zones of occupation. And this goes on for 4 years. It's not until 1923, 4 years later, 1923, that the boundaries of the Republic of Turkey are finally worked out with the loss of Greek control over this territory. I'm in the final stretches here. So, for Europe, national self-determination, formation of republics. For Turkey, after that difficulty of the Treaty of Sèvres, which the Turks reject, and the war for Turkish independence, you have a territorial claim for a nation state. This leads to ethnic cleansing, particularly of Greeks who are cast out, also Armenians, but they attempt to establish an ethno-political entity. But what of the rest of the holdings of the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire? Particularly the Ottoman Empire's holdings to the south, the Arab lands, and German holdings elsewhere. Does Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination apply to them? Not so much. The League of Nations takes control over these German colonies and gives them to the British or the French, or South Africa gets control of German Southwest Africa. Various islands in the Pacific go to Japan. One of the factors leading to the Pacific War, the World War II in Egypt. And the Arab lands are divided up amongst the French and the British. Again, Sykes-Picot. Here's their wish list. They're going to get all that territory. Again, diving deep up into what is now Turkey. And with this sort of arbitrary dividing line right along there. But what about the people on the ground? What about Faisal? Well, Faisal holds his own meeting. A meeting's held in Damascus in 1919, the Syrian National Congress. They said, we don't need the Europeans to create a state for us. We're going to create a Syrian kingdom, the Arab kingdom of Syria. And they draw these lines on the map. And in 1920, this exists as a kingdom. It's destroyed by the Franco-Syrian War. The French say, no, you can't declare a kingdom in this area. This is going to be our mandate. The French defeat Faisal's forces. Faisal goes into exile, goes to the United Kingdom. And then the United Kingdom says, well, okay, sorry about the Syria thing, sorry about the failed promises. How about the kingdom of Iraq? We'll give you the kingdom over here on this side of this boundary. So as the mandates are set up, Faisal, who for a few months controlled this area as his kingdom, goes into exile and then is brought back into control over this new nation state of Iraq. The French holdings are divided up into what eventually will become Syria and Lebanon. And importantly, there is much pluralism here. Sunni, Shia, Maronite, Christian communities, a whole bunch of different religious communities here. Also, the conflicts that have haunted the 20th century, one of the main conflicts of the 20th century into the 21st century, the conflict between Israel and Palestine. This has its creation in the dividing up of these former Ottoman lands. Again, promises have been made, both to Arab leaders and to Zionist leaders. This area is a British zone of occupation, a British mandate, and over the course of the next 2.5 decades, the British make promises to both sides. Yet at the same time, we have a demographic revolution with emigration to Palestine of European Jews. Initially, Zionist immigrants fleeing Russian, Tsarist repression, the horrifying pogroms. Later, fleeing Nazi persecution and other anti-Semitic persecutions in Europe. And this seemingly insurmountable political conflict that we have today, this political problem between Israel and Palestine is so difficult to disengage from, so difficult to solve, stems from this dividing land on a map, drawing lines on a map by Europeans in the early 20th century. Who's been left out of this discussion? Who's left out of the discussion at the Peace of Paris? Left out of Sykes-Picot? Also left out of the mandate system? The Kurdish people, who are in several different political boundaries here. In this new Republic of Turkey, in French mandate areas, in British mandate areas, and not given any consideration of establishing a system of national self-determination for them, or creating a ethno-linguistic or ethno-sectarian nation state for them. So one of the most important states to come out of these drawings of lines on the map has these important ethno-sectarian divides. A Shia majority towards the east, Sunni majority towards the west, and a Kurdish majority in the north. These are three different groups. This is not one united ethno-sectarian identity. Does that mean it can't be a state? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. If we abide by a very strict definition of what a nation is, as ethno-sectarian, then no, this is not a nation. But if we have an understanding of a nation that can work with pluralism, where you can have multiple nationalities, multiple ethnicities, multiple ethno-sectarian identities, then of course this could be a viable state. But it's not necessarily a nation.